Hey, John here. Before we jump into the podcast, I just want to let you know that this podcast is so helpful and informative. There are some truth nuggets that drop in this that are so helpful to understand a wide-ranging group of subjects. So Professor Craig Hawkins is a world expert in postmodern philosophy, as well as a theologian, and he's been an elder in churches that he's been a part of. He also has had a over 30-year radio call-in ministry. So he is incredibly knowledgeable on the subject of the social justice movement and the philosophy and theologies that have spawned from that movement. So I just want to let you know that you are in for a treat, because you're going to get historical backgrounds, you're going to get some philosophy, you're going to get some theology, you're going to get, but the whole goal is that your worldview is shaped and understood by the script, informed by the scriptures, so that when you hear these things coming out of our culture, coming out even from pulpits, sadly, that you are able to recognize it for what it is. You're able to discern truth from error. So I just want to welcome you to this podcast, and I'm so excited that you clicked on it. I hope you've got a pen ready. I hope you've got some paper, because this is some incredibly helpful material. Thanks for watching. Hi, Redeemer family. Thank you for joining me for another episode of Redeeming Truth. This is a exciting episode for me. I get to interview one of my favorite people, one of my all-time favorite professors, somebody who has had an absolutely massive impact on my life. And there are things maybe you'll hear in this conversation that you're going to go, wait, I've heard John say that. Well, now you would hear where it came from. And so before I get into that, at this point, I just want to make sure that you understand that as we do this podcast, it is critical for you to do two things. It's critical for you to subscribe to our podcast. You just click the little button that says subscribe to our Redeemer Bible Church page. You would click on that, and then you would also click that little bell that allows you to get notifications. That lets you know whenever we post a new video. It goes into your notifications on your phone, your computer, whatever, and then that way you can stay current on everything that we're doing. So today I'm with Craig Hawkins. He is a professor at Trinity Law School in California. And for the past 30 plus years, he has taught everything from the Bible to apologetics, theology, jurisprudence, and in particular, what we're going to be talking about today has to do with critical race theory and social justice. This is a movement that has gained an incredible amount of traction within Christianity in a very short amount of time, where it's become very popular. It's been growing for decades, but now it's really hit the scene in a very strong way over the past couple of years. And so I just want to be able to help you. What has happened over the past couple months is that I talk to parents who are saying to me, tears in their eyes, I've lost my son, I've lost my daughter to this movement. We can't even have conversations. We're not even going to have Thanksgiving or Christmas together because there's so much tension over this. And I don't even know what happened. One day they were great and they went away to college, or we homeschooled them for all their whole life. And then they go away to college and now they're back, and it is vitriolic. There's anger, there's guilt and shame. And the consistent pattern is I'm losing or I've lost my child. And so the heart behind this podcast is really to help people. It's really to help the people who go to our church, but really to help anybody who's going to watch this navigate through these ideas from a biblical framework. And so, Craig, as we get started today, what kind of qualifies you to talk on these issues?
Well, thanks, John. It's a pleasure to be with you and to be able to talk about these issues. What qualifies me is that I have graduate degrees really in about 5 different areas, including philosophy, cultural studies, apologetics, what have you. I've also been teaching for over 30 years at the graduate level. And my, I would say mentor, it wasn't mentor, but my advisor for my PhD work at one of the schools I attended was a Marxist. He had a doctorate in philosophy and in theology, was into liberation theology, and was teaching this type of stuff. So I was exposed to this stuff 25 years ago, and had a professor who was really involved in this. And also I've taught, as you mentioned, jurisprudence. And jurisprudence, one of the areas is called critical race theory that comes out of critical theory. So I've been teaching this for quite a while, teaching about it, not teaching it in the sense of that I imbibe this, but teaching about this for quite a while. Also, I teach and have a background in epistemology, which is part of philosophy, theory of knowledge, what you know, how you can know it. So in particular, besides my theological degrees and apologetic degrees, background in classical history and philosophy, but in particular because of the epistemology and jurisprudence is where I was exposed to this and have studied this for quite a while. So this is not new to me. It's new to many individuals, but I've been studying and been exposed to this many, many, many years ago.
So for me, that's why I wanted to get you on this podcast, because you have not only read the books, but you were in the classrooms where people were teaching this, where students were embracing it and promoting it, correct?
Yes, and I do want to say something before I forget. Many Christians, they mean well, but they have this idea that they raise their kids, and a lot of them take ownership of that, but then they send them off to college and they're done. But I would say you're not done. In fact, not just if you send them to a secular university, so-called, but if you send them to a Christian university. Many Christian schools are imbibing this stuff, teaching this stuff as well. And so I would say parents need to continue to have an active role in the formation of their children, not just through high school, but even through college and grad school. I would want to be having conversations with them, as I do with one of my children, my daughter, who's in college. What are you learning? What are you teaching? What are they teaching you, that is? And have a continued interaction. And as we're going to point out, you don't have to be an expert in all this stuff. You just need to be aware of it and some of the buzzwords in the vocabulary. And then you can consult someone who is knowledgeable about this. But this idea that we're done at high school, I totally disagree with.
That's helpful, and that's going to get to my very last question today: is what else would you say to parents? But before we get there, I want to ask you, how did we get here as a society in general? Where did all of this come from?
This stuff has been being taught at the university and college level, collegiate level, for quite a while. This goes clear back to the 60s. Maybe I'll give a brief history if you want, and yeah. I'm truncating that just to get to the point. There's a jumping off point, and it'll help to have an understanding. But this stuff has been being taught, and critical theories, we're going to see, has multiple meanings depending on the discipline, but there's some things it has in common. But what happened was, long story shorter, with the rise of Marxism, the thoughts of Karl Marx, dialectical materialism, and the idea of class warfare and the proletariat versus the bourgeois, if you will, this came up in many, many nations, including Russia, the former Soviet Union, if you will. And of course, they had the revolution in 1917 and embraced this stuff, various forms of it. And then in 1918, after World War I, communism was also Marxism. I'm just going to use those interchangeably. There's differences, but for to make it easier on myself, and so I don't constantly have to qualify things. I'm just going to use them as interchangeable. But there's some key differences, but they're clearly related to each other as well. But many people, to the point were dumbfounded why Marxism, why communism didn't take over in Germany in 1918. There were certainly Marxists there and people who were advocating for communism. And so many people were disappointed, that is Marxists. They were actually disappointed that the revolution did not continue into places like Germany. And so there was the attempt to understand why. Many intellectuals just couldn't figure out what was wrong with the people. Why didn't the people embrace this? The idea is, as soon as you get the skinny on capitalism, you see how bad it is, you would just automatically embrace Marxism. I mean, it's a no-brainer to them. So why were the people so recalcitrant? Why did they continue with capitalism, which is this evil, and not embrace the liberating spirit of Marxism and communism? And so eventually, in the early 20s, 1923-ish, there was an organization founded called the Institute for Social Research in Germany, in Frankfurt, became associated with the University of Frankfurt, the Frankfurt School, that's called. And they we're talking about Marxism and whatnot. Then, through a change of leadership in 1930, an individual named Horkheimer became the head of the Institute and changed the emphasis, not just studying classical Marxism, but what were the social dynamics? What were the underlying factors that kept people enslaved? I'll use some very strong vocabulary, enslaved to capitalism. Why didn't they just throw off the yoke of capitalism and be emancipated, be liberated? These are their terms, by Marxism, by communism. And so they wanted to look at, that is Horkheimer, then a gentleman named Marcuse, also Adorno, and then Erich Fromm, a psychologist, joined them as well, among others. And their work was to understand the sociological, cultural dynamics and factors that the underpinning presuppositions that kept people enslaved in capitalism. What were the factors that entrenched them and kept them from coming to this acceptance, this embracing of Marxism? That's the key idea. And then they wrote a lot of works. They had to leave Germany because of Adolf Hitler and the rise of Nazism. But they come to schools like New York University, Columbia, Berkeley, obviously very high-powered schools. And then eventually they go back. But that's the origins of this. So it was looking at the presuppositions that it enslaved people. And it's looking at one of the key concepts is class warfare. And again, there's all these other terms like alienation and Aufhebung I could talk about. And I'm not going to go there. It gets just too heavy. The point is they want to look at this stuff. And then the stuff gets picked up in America by a number of intellectuals, including someone named Duncan Kennedy, who teaches at Harvard. He buys into this. And he switches from critical theory, which that term was coined by Horkheimer in a famous essay in the 1930s, critical theory. Critical theory basically evolves or devolves into critical race theory. So critical theory is based upon what's called neo-Marxism, the new Marxism. It's not just classical Marxism and all about economics, but it's the cultural dynamics we've been talking about, psychology, sociology, anthropology, bringing all that to bear. So Marxism itself can't do the job. It needs contributions from other disciplines like sociology. So they take that, and then neo-Freudianism. It's not the old Freud, if you know the stages of development, allegedly from Freud. It would even be eventually influenced by a guy named Jacques Lacan, dies in 1980. But anyways, Fromm heavily influences this and his view of psychology. Getting to the point. So Duncan Kennedy picks this up and he brings it into the legal community, and he's a professor at Harvard, and he's teaching that at Harvard. So obviously one of the high-powered law schools. And then this morphs into what's called critical race theory. So there's a number of critical theories, and one of them is critical race theory. Probably the most famous student would be Derek Bell. And he picks this up and develops it and runs with it and develops what we call technically critical race theory. Real quickly, again, then his most famous student was Kimberly Williams Crenshaw. Kimberly Crenshaw picks this up, and she develops even what's called intersectionality. So the standard books, I've got a bunch of them here. You can't necessarily see them, but I've got a ton of books, if it matters, that I've taught from and used and whatnot and have read and all that good stuff. And so her views continue on Bell's view with more push because of the term intersectionality. This becomes a very virile form of jurisprudence. But it's not just that. It's actually picked up. It's actually picked up and goes into cultural studies, literature studies, English studies, what have you. So it moves out of the legal field and it spreads into, again, the social sciences and literature studies to where today it dominates in universities. It's up there with postmodernism. I mean, basically, you're a young person, or if you're going to college, you're not going to get through college or university without getting exposed to this in one way, shape, or form of it. And even in so-called conservative Christian schools, this stuff still is picked up. It's just assumed to be true, and any educated, intelligent 21st century person needs to know this. So it's been being taught at a massive level in our colleges and universities for 20, 30 years or more. And so we're just seeing it come out now and at a popular level, but it's been there for quite a while. from its origins in the 60s and going back there to the 30s.
Gotcha. So I read an article recently where it was in Christianity Today, and the editor said, nobody really knows what critical race theory means. It's a bugaboo word, everybody imports their own definitions into it. So could you give us a definition of critical race theory? And then you use the word intersectionality as well. Could you define both?
Mm-hmm. And yeah, there is a lot of different definitions, but there are a number of books. Like here's a dictionary on critical race theory. Here's another one, Oxford Dictionary on Critical Race Theory, and so on and so forth. But critical theory, again, is the idea. There's a number of meanings. Some of it is Kantian. Kant talks about being pre-critical, naive, if you will. But critical here is, in the sense, it's to understand the assumptions, the presuppositions of a culture. Why is a culture, let's say, dominated by capitalism? What are the dynamics? What are the thought patterns and sources? What's the Weltanschauung in the German, the Deutsch term? What's the Weltanschauung? What are the underlying presuppositions that form it? So critical is trying to get underneath that and see what's going on, not just what you hold, but why do you hold this? Why do you believe this? And one more time, what things in culture reinforce, let's say, capitalism, and keep people from embracing Marxism? So that's critical theory. Is just not just in a sense of a theory or an idea, but it is the whole structure that now comes with this, from sociology, psychology, anthropology, to explain all this. So again, critical theory, two key components, though. The two key ones are neo-Marxism, the new Marxism, not just classical Marxism with class warfare, dialectical materialism, but specifically bringing in other disciplines. You need, again, sociology to shed light to understand how to change a society. What is the good society? Okay. Yeah. So neo-Marxism and then neo-Freudianism, the new Freudianism. If you've ever read, I have outlines and material on Jacques Lacan. It's completely different than Freud. Most people know Freud as the individual who had these 4 or 5 stages of sexual development, and these are key. You read Jacques Lacan and you don't even recognize it's Freudian. It's completely different. Those are the two key factors behind this. Critical theory, and stating from their own works, the major works, classical critical theory, is dealing with liberation. It's the emancipation of humanity. The idea is kind of like this. I'll use even Duncan Kennedy. He basically said, even what you think is good and is helpful in our legal system is still part of this machine. It's still part of, can I use the word, the Matrix, if you've ever seen those movies, that enslaves people, that binds us. We are so blinded to our own condition. We don't even realize how bad it is. We don't realize how enmeshed we are in the machine, the machinations of capitalism. So critical theory is an attempt to show people to take off the mask. We're all going to a Halloween party. It's to take off the mask. It's to expose reality, to let people see reality as it really is, and quit being so naive about capitalism and see the liberating, emancipating, life-bringing, life-fulfilling doctrines of Marxism and communism, or neo-Marxism at least.
So neo-Marxism is taking Marxism out of economic questions and applying it to society.
Right. We're not just using economic categories to analyze. Our analysis is not just economics. It's not just alienation, that is the worker, the proletariat being isolated from their work, from either their product or services they produce. Classical Marxism, we need to bring in these other sciences to give us and shed light on why we think the way we do. Yes, and then neo-Freudianism, in particular, this new psychology. So those are the two prongs that really undergird critical race theory.
So then there's critical theory in general and legal studies, and then that is applied to race, feminism, gender studies, even weight studies. It's applied across the board now.
Precisely. And I think I said critical race theory. It does underlie, it underlies critical theory, which underlies critical race theory.
Right.
But you're right. So critical race theory is just one. There's queer crit, Now that's their term, and queer is their term. Radical feminism, not just feminism, but radical feminism. And there's various types of all this and shades and whatnot. Again, I've got dozens of books. I mean, even among the queer crit, they disagree. But whether it's Judith Butler, you see Berkeley or others' views. Yes, but then of course, modernism. Yeah, but yes, critical race theory, queer crit, radical feminism. There's a number of movements, and then its whole development, related but slightly different in literature studies. But these basic ideas are underneath it all.
So it sounds like it creates I don't want to get into critique too much, but I can't help it. Sounds like it creates a class of, like Duncan Hunter, you were saying that we are part of the matrix. The system is blinded you from being able to see the system itself and how it oppresses you. But somehow he was able to break free from that.
Right. Well, there are some people who've seen the light. And so let me just do this segue to make, hopefully, not be too redundant, but I'd rather be redundant and make it clear. So it moves from analysis of class warfare, as in classical critical theory, and why do not people embrace Marxism as opposed to capitalism? Now it's moved in critical race theory to particularly why do whites are the new capitalism, if you will, just move that over. And why do they oppress people of color? So people of color, there's only two groups of people, the oppressors and the oppressees, and whites now, not just class, because class can be some blacks against some blacks or Hispanics or what have you. Mm-hmm. No, this is now all about whites oppressing people of color, particularly in this case, blacks.
Okay, and then intersectionality briefly, what does that mean?
That's just adding other factors. So the view would be, it's simply adding one or more to the original one of let's say, race.
Okay.
So someone who's a female would say, I've got two strikes against me. I am discriminated against not only because of my color. Now they use the term race. I'm going to use ethnicity. I believe there's only one race, but not to be too confusing. So they say, I suffer because of my race and I'm a female. And let's say she's also bisexual. Now she's got 3 strikes against her. So that's the latter two are forms of intersectionality. It is multiple forms, they would say, of discrimination, not just race or ethnicity, but things like social economic status, gender, sexual preference, religion, non-religion. 2 or more of any of these factors now brings in simply what's called intersectionality.
And at that point, they are the only ones that can speak to oppression, right? The person that has more strikes against them, quote unquote, they have a unique insight into knowledge that somebody, say, who's white or who has less checks against them, they don't have access to.
Precisely. So even some among the feminists, some who are colored will say, you white women have no idea what we're talking about. Don't speak for us. They would reject what they call essentialism. Essentialism is there's something in common to various ideas. And they'd say there's no such thing as essentialism regarding feminism. It's a person of color's discrimination as a feminist versus bisexual versus what have you. They're all different. You can't just say this fits all of them. But nonetheless, yes, they alone have the experience. They alone have been oppressed. They alone can speak about it. So a white person like me, I'm the worst of all. I'm a white male and a law professor. Oh my goodness, it's really bad. I have white privilege. Even by just talking like this shows I have white fragility, to use D'Angelo's terms. And there's this whole vocabulary, but to your point, the vocabulary that goes with this, yes, only they have had this experience, only they can address it. I can do the work. That's what it's called, do the work and try to understand my whiteness and try to overcome my whiteness, or at least try to minimize it. It's never going away. I will never be over it. Some extreme Christians are saying even that it's debatable whether I can even be saved as a white male. Wow. But I never get over this, but I can do the work, but I can at least be quiet and let them speak or speak out against racism. But only they have the expertise. Only they have the experience.
So some are calling that ethnic Gnosticism. Is that an accurate way to look at it? Is there a better way to look at it? And how would you respond to that?
I'm uncomfortable with that. I think the term Gnosticism gets abused a lot and used all over the place. if we understand the Gnostic movements of people like Basilides and Valentius and others in the early church, Cerinthius, who apparently John was dealing with in 1 John. I understand it if you want to say there's an experience, but it's not really secret. See, in Gnosticism, these were esoteric experience and knowledge. It wasn't just knowledge. It was experiences and knowledge. It was like via the occult, the occluded, the hidden. And so, yes, it's true that they believe only they had the experience. It's really more a form of existentialism or experientialism. So I want to be technical in my epistemological categories. I don't use the term the new Gnosticism because I think that's problematic. I get what people are saying. Yeah. I don't think it's very accurate.
That's helpful. So how do you respond to somebody who says you're a white male and I'm a black lesbian female and you have no access to anything that I've experienced and you can't even speak to racism because of who you are?
Well, sure. Let me put a few more things on the table, though, because it gets more difficult than even as you've painted it. So, according to people like Derek Bell and others, really, who were at the source of this development, if I disagree, if I ask questions, but not just to embrace it, I'm just showing. Now, Delangelo, in her book White Fragility, calls it white fragility. So I'm just showing, another author says, I'm using the master's tools in the master's house because I'm a white guy. So objectivity, evidence, all that is just part of my toolbox to keep myself in power. See, it's all about power. We can bring in Michael Foucault. It's about power. These are power relationships. I'm in the power seat. And that's why only a white can be a racist, is because we alone allegedly have the power. And so all that shows my bias. All of that shows that I can't get it. So if I would ask, let's say, could you give me some evidence? I just want to know, or the statement that more black men are killed, unarmed black men are killed by police in America every year than whites. I say, could you give me some evidence? That just shows my fragility. That just shows my bias, that I'm enslaved in this whiteness. In fact, there's a book called The Weapons of Whiteness, and it goes through things like this. So even objectivity. In fact, Derek Bell would say, if I were to question, even I would say non-antagonistically, just say, could you tell me about this? Could you explain this to me or give me some evidence? You might get a response like this. I will not even stoop to dignify your questions. These are just cover. You're just masking your hostility and not getting how deep the rabbit hole goes, so to speak. I'm not going to dignify that with a response. And this idea of people get promoted by merit, once again, that's a white man's tool. Objectivity, logic, rationality, white man's tool. Even in the Museum of Blacks or Blackness that they have in DC, they took it down apparently, but they had a section talking about white values, and one of them was things like objectivity, looking for evidence. So there's a couple of terms we need to understand. Just a few more terms. I know it gets a little heavy, but people can go back and go over this to help us understand what's going on here. So one of them is relativism. Let's just start with that. I've got three key terms that need to be looked at. One of them is relativism. Relativism, now there's epistemological relativism, and there's moral relativism and other forms. I'm just going to make it easy and deal with moral relativism. Moral relativism says there's no universal or absolute truth that is true for what? All times, all people, all places, and all circumstances. So whether something is right or wrong is contingent or relative to the times, people, places, or circumstances. Mm-hmm. And those change whether something's right or wrong, or true or false. So relativism. So epistemological relativism says now there's no universal objective knowledge. By the way, people get confused here. People think these people are saying there's no objective knowledge. That's not quite true. There's no universal objective knowledge. That's the distinction that needs to be made. There's no knowledge that is true for all times, all people, all places, all circumstances. So epistemological relativism, moral relativism. Second of all, we need to talk about identity politics. Identity politics or identity epistemology is really just this view. Things vary or are true only for a given group. So white males have their truths, their science, black females would have theirs, bisexual Asian women would have theirs, and never they shall meet. And so they're different. Related to this, another term is called standpoint. In other words, it's from your standpoint, from where you're standing, this would be true, this would be false or not relevant. So standpoint epistemology, standpoint politics, or identity, same difference. They're interchangeable terms, basically. Now, I know it's a lot. One more, though, and it really helps understand this. Social constructivism. It has various names: perspectivalism, constructivism, social constructivism, cultural constructivism. Same difference. They're basically the same, okay? And that basically says, once again, there's no universal objective truths. So not universal, not objective, but there are truths that are objectively so for a given people, a given group of people, or culture or subculture, or time or place. Now that's difficult. I realize it's hard to get your mind around that, but let's try this. In America, all things equal, we drive on the right side of the road. Now, barring an accident or a police telling you to go over the line, or construction workers, what have you, you drive on the right side of the road. If you don't drive on the right side of the road, or you run a red light, the police officer is going to pull you over. And if you say, well, that's just your subjective opinion, he or she is going to write you up probably with glee and say, just keep talking. And no, here's the traffic code, right? And here it is, and you violated this. So it's objective. No, and it's not universal. In Great Britain or Australia, they drive all things equal on the left side, the quantibus omnibus, all things equal, right? In India, they drive wherever they want, okay? But the point is, it's not absolute. In America, all things equal, drive on the right. Australia, Great Britain, drive on the left. It's objective, but it's not universal. It's not always true, because there are exceptions, and it's not true for everybody. One more, the Constitution. It's objective. You can talk about the Bill of Rights, the 10th, but you can talk about 27 amendments to the Constitution. It's objective, but it's not absolute in the sense that it can't be amended. There's a process. So people get confused because they either want to talk radical subjective relativism or this absolute objectivism. But I call it a halfway house, and that is social constructivism is objective, but it's not absolute. Now, here's the point, and here, hopefully this will help. This is where critical race theory plays. This is where it lives, in the world of social constructivism. I think some thinkers make the mistake of not explaining this and not explaining this clearly. They confuse themselves or just don't think about it. And so this explains how they can say the things they do, but also, I believe, how you can refute this and show that the absurdity of this, holds the key of explaining why it's problematic, to say the least. So, at any rate, those are concepts that I know are difficult. People can review them, but if you don't get these concepts, you don't know how to answer and interact with these concerns.
So for this episode, I want to ask one more question, and that question is, so how did we get here in the church?
The church is often a day late and a dollar short, generally about 20 years behind the world, and then we imbibe what the world's gone through. It's like the emperor has no clothes. The latest fad and fashions, we want to embrace, thinking somehow we're being relevant. I appreciate at least the attempt on the part of many Christians to be relevant. Martin Luther said, unless we can preach the gospel of contemporary relevance, we've not preached it. So I appreciate that. The problem is we imbibe these things that are actually antithetical to the gospel. I know you're actually teaching a series in Galatians, and I think you're going to bring that out. You're bringing that out, that we mean well, but we bring in things that actually are antithetical, i.e. opposed to the gospel. We may not mean to do that. We don't mean to say that or do that, but it's what we do because we don't understand the implications. We don't understand the Trojan horse that we've led into our city. And then we can't figure out what went wrong. How did my kids go south on me? I don't understand.
Yeah.
And let me say this, John, because I'd be remiss. Racism is an issue. I'm not trying to belittle it. I'm not saying it doesn't exist. I'm not saying it doesn't exist in the church. But that's not the same thing. Dealing with racism is not the same thing as embracing critical race theory. They're at a whole different level from each other.
So it found a home in evangelicalism because there was a movement about 20 years ago that planted the seeds of postmodernism in evangelicalism that has now grown, and that growth has become the embracing of things like critical race theory, intersectionality, is something that we can integrate with the gospel. Is that correct?
Right. Yeah, and Christians are, to their credit, many of them sensitive to racism. And so that they see that and they think, oh, racism is a problem, is an issue. I don't want to belittle or depreciate my friends' perspectives who are people of color and have had discrimination done against them. Then they think but to counter that, to deal with that, I have to embrace, for example, Black Lives Matter, not the slogan, but the actual movement, the organization, I should say, and or critical race theory. And again, they're two related but different things.
And so about 20 years ago, there was the Emergent Church.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like the Emergent Church has gone away as a movement, but this shows that it really didn't go away altogether.
Mm-hmm. No. And the church, many people thought something like this, many Christian leaders, oh, modernism, bad, very bad. Modernism, bad. Postmodernism, good, or at least, okay, not all of it, but many key tenets of postmodernism, we can embrace those. And I would argue neither of them are all good or all bad, but there's some serious problems with both of them. But people tend to pendulum. We go from one extreme to another. Oh, modernism and scientism is just thrash Christianity, so it's bad. Postmodernism, they seem to be open. Seem to be the operative word here. And then we embrace that. And you're right, it didn't go away. It came to roost. It came to seed. Those seeds, to mix my metaphors, that we planted now are sprouting and they're producing fruit. I would argue bad fruit. And then people are going, and how did we get here?
Right, which is the question that I'm asking you. How did we get here, society as well as in the church? So for somebody who's heard all of what you've just said now, the question that I would have is, biblically, what is the problem with critical race theory?
The problem with it is it supplants and almost replaces the gospel. Here, salvation isn't really just acknowledging your sin. All of us, it's in particular for white people. All white people, we need to explain this. All white people are racist, according to this view. Every single white person. So if there's an interracial marriage, a white person and a person of color, the white person is always trying to get over and take advantage of the person of color. But it's never the other way around. So the problem is it replaces the sin issue, which is universal, the sin, are falling short of the glory of God, not living up to God's holy and righteous and perfect standards, which we all are guilty of and all need to repent of and all need forgiveness and continued sanctification. So there's positional righteousness by Christ, who imputes to us his righteousness, absolutely, as we're told, for example, in Romans 5:2, 5:7 through 9, and elsewhere. But that's positional, but then there's practical righteousness. We all need to continue to grow in our most holy faith. But now this really puts it basically on white people. White people are really the problem. The issue, even if they'll say the sin, the sin issue is whiteness, is prejudice, is discrimination by whites against blacks. And that is at best, I mean, it does exist. It's a problem. It is in the church, as I've already said. I want to say that because I know people are going to listen to this and people are going to say, Hawkins doesn't even think that some Christians are racist. I didn't say that. I'm not saying that. But to make it the problem is now to distort what the issue is. Because with all due respect, I'm going to argue black people, and I've met plenty who are just as racist as some of the biggest rednecks I've ever met. Some, not all, some are. And it confuses the sin problem, therefore it confuses the salvation issue. What is salvation? Which really means in Hebrew and Greek, deliverance. What is deliverance? Is it just from my whiteness, the weapons of my whiteness, my distorted, contorted worldview of whites are superior, white supremacists, what have you? No, that could be one sin. Sin is manifest at many, many, many levels. And so I believe it messes up the whole gospel message.
And so a person who is from a minority group can't be racist according to this theory, correct?
Yeah, because they don't have the power. I've had students tell me, I don't have the power. I often ask my students, are all whites racist? Can only whites be racist? And I've heard many times, yes, because you alone have the power. White people have it over consciously and unconsciously, they think that way of people of colors. So I've had many look me in the eyes and say, yeah, I can't be a racist. I don't have the power.
So it has nothing to do with ethnic hatred then?
Depends. It could. Classically, we didn't really define racism. There's at least three views that are offered of racism. The third one, I'm going to argue, is problematic. But clearly one form of racism is defined is the idea of animus. And it's often it tends to, the first one, animus is just, I don't like people. I don't like this group of people. So animus in Latin, I hate them, don't like them. That's one. The second form is the idea of superiority. I may or may not hate this group of people, but I'm superior. Now here we hear things like the term, the white man's burden. I've got to take care of other races because I'm superior. So those are two, out of animus or the idea of superiority. This group, this ethnic group or race is superior to another. But the third one is indifference. Some would say even indifference is racism. Now, I find that very problematic, and we can discuss that or not. But if someone, let's say, knows racism exists at their country club, but they don't actively fight against it, they don't support it, they disagree, but they don't actually actively get involved in ending, let's say, racism or discriminatory practices based out of the idea of superiority and or hatred of other groups, does that make them a racist? See, where we've moved today is even the third category makes you a racist as well. If you're not actively combating racism, if you're not anti-racist, then you are a racist.
That's if you're not doing the work that you're supposed to.
Yes. And that's the term, the work, constantly going through my stuff and identifying how at a conscious, unconscious level, I am a racist and contributing to the oppression of other ethnic groups.
So if I'm a Christian and I'm watching television or I'm sitting in church or I'm reading a book or I'm listening to a podcast and I hear somebody say, I reject critical race theory. I reject it outright. It's anti-gospel. What buzzwords should Christians be listening for that really tell them that the person who said that really embraces critical race theory? They may not even know it.
Right, and because it's the idea, even just that vocabulary, but key term would be like white fragility. You're manifesting white privilege, and there's so many terms, John. To be honest, we could go through so many of them, and they're readily available at certain websites, and that I can mention those. But it's just the whole vocabulary. If you're not actively involved in combating this, if you don't, you've got to confess. We talked about a different view of sin, a different view of salvation, even confession. Here, confession is, I'm a racist. I am closeted or otherwise. I'm a racist. I acknowledge it, and I'm repenting of it. And so that's part and parcel of that. So they'll even go so far to some as you must confess I'm a racist, or you hear this, say so-and-so's name or what have you, or yeah. I have to say every person of color who's shot by the police, every case is always racism. If you deny that, then see that proves that you are suffering from white privilege. You have white fragility.
So when it comes to these kinds of things, I've heard it said by Christians, they kind of want to take a mediating position. So they want to say, hey, we reject critical race theory, but we want to love our neighbors. And so is this an attack on love, to like a video, even a video like this, trying to help people think through this issue so they understand it biblically, they understand it even philosophically? The struggle that I'm sensing in people is that I don't want to be unloving. And for me, I want to say, I want us to be biblical and accurate. And when we will be loving. And so help me think through this.
Right. And I would argue this is the way many people are brought into this critical race theory. And again, the example, the phrase Black Lives Matter. If someone says that to me and they ask me, is that true? I'd say, well, of course it's true. They matter. If you mean the slogan or the thought, Black Lives Matter, of course they do. But if you mean by that the movement Black Lives Matters, which at least two of the three original founders are avowed Marxists, no, that group is dedicated to the destruction of the family, against Christianity, the gospel of salvation through the Lord Jesus Christ. So what happens, though, is a Christian who is sensitive to loving people and wanting to embrace people and show the love of God, they're confused with that very legitimate sentiment and attitude versus now accepting the neo-Marxism that goes with Black Lives Matter and the mantra of critical race theory, which is completely hostile to the gospel. So as you're saying, we would argue by being correct biblically, we are indeed showing the ultimate form of love. The church has said for millennia or two that orthodoxy is related to orthopraxy. Right doctrine should produce right practice and vice versa. And so by imbibing a false system, while it sounds good, but in fact a false system, we are really not loving people. We are acquiescing to an ungodly, unbiblical system of thought that is dedicated to the destruction of the family and the church and the gospel of Jesus Christ as it's been given to us.
Is it accurate to say that evangelicalism has always had a problem with this, imbibing unbiblical, anti-biblical philosophies and trying to integrate them into Christian theology?
Yes. In fact, many theologians have said, and I think rightly so. In fact, in my education, I actually had classes on contemporary and classical culture. Spent a lot of time in certain classes reading what we would call heretical culture, heretical theology. Most of these individuals, whether it was, I'm trying to think, the father of, starts with an S of liberalism.
Schleiermacher.
Anyway, Schleiermacher, thank you so much. And others, they thought they were defending Christianity. Immanuel Kant and his reworking of Christianity thought he was saving it from obscenity and being rejected by intelligent people. Rudolf Bultmann, the list goes on, and Brunner, the list goes on. And the church has continually, over and over again, fought the issue of how can we relate to people, meet them where they are, and love them truly in their own communities, but without giving in to what their sinful thoughts and lifestyle. I think of Paul in 1 Corinthians 9. He wants to be all things to all people that he might all possible means win some. But then he says, I'm not that I'm going to go out and get drunk and do drugs and sexual immorality, but I will attempt to bridge the gap and meet people where they are with the gospel without compromising. And just real quickly, John, I think that 2 Corinthians 10, starting with about verse 3, really applies here as well. Actually, in verse 2, Paul says in 2 Corinthians 10, 2 and following, I beg you that when I come, I may not have to be as bold as some expect me to be towards those who live by the standards of this world. So people in the church, but actually living by the standards of this world, right? Mm-hmm. He says, the weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power. They have divine power to demolish arguments. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. And we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. So over and over again, for example, we see in 1 John and in the epistle written to the church of Colossae, they're dealing with forms of Gnosticism or pre-Gnosticism. And Paul's warning them, don't imbibe this, don't accept this. Here's a way to look at this. Why are we told in Romans 12, 1 and 2, those two beautiful verses about, again, not being conformed to the world, but being transformed, anakinosis, being transformed by the renewing, the word is there, we get a word metamorphosis from transforming, but be renewed, anakinosis, of our minds. We're not to conform to the schema, the pattern of this world, but to be transformed by the gospel. But sin can be subtle. And once again, I feel for our brothers and sisters who are saying, well, I just want to love people. Racism is horrible. It's an egregious sin, to which I agree. I just want to combat that and show them we love and care. I agree with that. But but you cannot do that by imbibing full-on Black Lives Matter and their teachings of the organization and Thousand Currents and all the other organizations behind them and around them that are in league with them, and or critical race theory, because these are other gospels. These are indeed not only other gospels, therefore they're antithetical. They are opposed to the gospel. And that's why, what is Paul? Doesn't he warn us in Galatians 1? Twice, right? don't be deceived, not by another Jesus, another spirit, another gospel, 2 Corinthians 11, but these counterfeits, which are really no gospel. These are perennial issues. The problem's not going away. It's still here.
So my problem with all this was that I thought it would go away pretty quickly, and I was wrong. I thought that evangelical leaders would see this for what it is, but it's because I have a background in philosophy. You were one of my teachers. You're my main teacher. And I have a background in philosophy. I have a background in history. And so I knew 100 years ago there was a social gospel. There was a social movement that infiltrated the church, split denominations, split churches. And so I thought, okay, our evangelical higher up leaders, the conference speakers and all that, they're going to see it. They're going to call it out. They're going to see what it is. This is an unbiblical philosophy coming in. It's an attack on the gospel. And so I thought this will pass just like the Emergent Church passed. And I was wrong. It's only been embraced by them. They see it as helpful, as a helpful way to understand society. And I think, what did I miss here?
That's really important what you just said, and I want to revisit that. That's very, very important. Two thoughts on that. There's kind of a saying that the problem with most theologians is they need some philosophy classes. They need to be taught by some philosophers, some things that is. Yeah. The problem with most philosophers is they need some theology classes. They need to be taught by theologians. So many of our well-meaning brothers and sisters, even in leadership, I'm going to use this, I'm going to say this, are naive. They really don't get it. They've not really studied this. Look, I studied this stuff at some of the foremost universities in America, if not the world, okay? And with some of the brightest bulbs in the world. And you get to see this stuff unpacked and what they really mean by it and what they're going to do with it. And there are many Christians, not just the hoi polloi, not just the laity, the people in the pews, in our seminaries and in our other institutions of higher education in the church, who've bought into stuff. They're naive. They don't get it. I've taught logic and critical thinking for years, for decades. And I would argue these guys need some serious classes like that. They just don't see. Let me give you an example. One denomination said, well, okay, we reject it as a worldview, overall worldview, but there are analytical tools or aspects, I forget the exact language of the resolution, but there's analytic aspects of it that can be helpful. What analytic aspects? First of all, they don't believe in analysis and analytics as such. All that's nonsense to them. It is the learned experience that matters. I've experienced this and non-colored people have not, therefore you can't really speak to this. And how do you deal with this? You have to get every white person to admit they're a racist and do the work for the rest of their life because they're a racist. Every single one. As James Lindsay says, New Discourses, I think it's a great website. Him and Peter Pagosian and the gal involved with them as well. Puckrose, phenomenal. They're atheists, but I can work more with them. I have more in common with them than I do with this stuff, even brothers and sisters who buy into this. But it's always everywhere, to use their phrase, always everywhere. Every white person is a manifestation of racism, and it's ubiquitous. It's everywhere and always. I eat, sleep, and drink being a racist. And again, am I saying I've never had a thought that was sinful? I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that I'm a racist and everything. It's like, that's nonsense. And I'm not going to embrace this. And I'm not going to say, okay, I'm a racist and I'm always everywhere I'm a racist. It's not true. I sound funny, and I've had students I've had to say this to. I don't even like talking like this. And they've had their responders. And I said, man, my black friends I've had for 25, 30 years, they're all going to be shocked about this. They had no idea I was such a racist. It's not just that it's insulting. It's nonsense. Because there's no standards to disprove it. This is a non-falsifiable, viciously circular thinking that you can't falsify it, because anything any contesting on your part, disagreement, or asking for objective evidence just proves that it's true. Yep. Could you imagine doing this, John, in a trial, in a court of law? Well, the fact that the defendant is disagreeing and says they're not guilty just proves that they're guilty. That's crazy talk. Yeah. Which one of our dear friends, Christian or not, involved in Black Lives Matter, the movement, or in critical race theory, is going to say, in a court of law, God forbid, civil criminal case, if they're hauled into court, that's right, the fact that I disagree just proves that I'm guilty. See, you have to give real world concrete examples to show that in every other area of life, people who think like this, we put them away because they're a danger to themselves and society.
Now they get tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars in book deals and public appearances.
Yes. So when I hear theologians or others saying, so I don't accept it as a worldview, but there are key aspects that we can learn from it and are valuable, I'm challenging them right now. Well, what are those aspects? Please, pray tell me, what are those?
Yeah.
I would submit, no. If you're saying that racism exists in the church, I agree, but that's not critical race theory.
Yeah.
That'd be like saying that because houses burned down, I think we need a fire department in every other house or something. That doesn't follow.
So is there a difference between social justice and biblical justice?
Unfortunately, the two often are different today. There are some great thinkers like Frank Gabeline, who's a phenomenal theologian. You can go back and find a really good article on this topic. I think very biblical, but most people don't even know who Frank Gabeline was or his father. Phenomenal theologian.
Arlo, right?
So, yes, thank you.
Yeah.
So unfortunately today, for many, it's the same. And I would argue many Christians who mean well have confused the biblical concept. There is much in the Bible about justice. God wants us to treat the orphans well, the poor, the oppressed, if you will, which are orphans, which are widows, which are foreigners, or people, immigrants, if you will. There's dozens of passages. I could cite many of them right now if we wanted to. So that concept is there because there is an outworking of the gospel. God is a God of justice. And that is not just, it's not quite the word or phrase I want, not just, but it certainly is regarding our own justification before God, a la the Reformation's view of justification, dikaiao, that beautiful word, the concept of be declared righteous, this legal forensic term. But also God wants us to be just. He wants us, practically speaking, in our lives to treat others justly. But that's not the same as buying onto the group Black Lives Matter, critical race theory. Now, John, I'm not sure you want to deal with this, but maybe I'll put it in here if you don't mind. We can wait. So let me go back to a little bit of refutation. So if I say that to disagree proves I have this, that's why I talked earlier about social constructivism. Because social constructivism, also known as the problem with it called the contextual fallacy, William Dembski, a brilliant mathematician, philosopher, Christian thinker, calls it the contextual fallacy, I think rightly so. If I teach that all truth is relative to a given group, time, place, people, circumstances, again, the big four, then that would apply to this view. So someone says, in my view, all whites are racist. And I say, thank you very much, I appreciate that. But I'm not in your group. I'm in another group. And for me, that's not true. So how can they refute my view? They can't. All they can say is, well, I don't like it. I don't think you're in touch with reality. And I say the same thing. I don't think you're in touch with reality. So once you've committed to relativism, therefore, again, my point in defining these terms, epistemological, moral, once you've committed to social constructivism and or identity or standpoint epistemology, you've basically refuted your own view, or all you can say is what's true for me, moi, or my people, the people I identify with, ethnically, race, social, economically, sexual preference, age, religion. It's true for us. But so what? So keep it to yourself then. I'm not in your group. See, what they're saying is there's no universal truths, but that's universally true. It's universally true that there are no universal truths. That is a self-stultifying, the technical term, self-referentially refuting statement. That's like saying, I cannot utter a word in English. You'd say, but excuse me, Mr. Hawkins, I think you just did. No. You clearly don't get it. You're obviously hostile to what I'm saying. I'm going to spend the next 6 hours explaining to you, proving to you that I cannot utter a word in English. You'd say, that's ludicrous. Like I tell you, my family owns the world-class collection of square circles. My biological brother, by the way, is an only child. My biological parents have no children. That's not profound. You don't need to go and meditate on that. You don't need to go and have some deep experience with Jesus on that. That's nonsense. Pious nonsense. You can have pious nonsense, but it's still nonsense. And so I don't mean to be mean. That's why in books, I love books like this. This is Beyond All Reason. This is by Daniel Farber and Susanna Sherry, and they deal with, among other things, critical race theory and the law. And they show how, I'm not trying to be mean, how ludicrous this view is. It's self-refuting, just like saying, I cannot utter a word in English. So again, if you tell me truth is relative to a given community, again, sexual preference or religion, ethnicity, what have you, then I'd say, fine, I'm not part of your community. That's not true for me. And you, by your own views, have to admit it's only true for you, not for me. So thank you for playing. I don't want to talk about it anymore.
So,
in fact, go ahead, John.
No, you go ahead.
I can give some radical quotes by feminists even saying, there's one gal in particular who was a well-known epistemologist, and she talked about how she would follow the argument based on her professional training as a philosopher. She would follow the objective evidence and logic argumentation to the view. But when she accepted radical feminism, she said, and so much for logic and reason. If it helps me in my views, great. If it doesn't, it's expendable.
Pragmatism.
Paraphrase. Yeah, it doesn't work for me based on pragmatism. I reject it.
Right.
But does she want to say that the neo-Nazi or skinhead or the radical male chauvinist, that's okay then? I mean, it doesn't work for her, but it works for them. So after all, it must be okay, or at least for them.
Yeah, there's a lot of stealing of virtue from Christianity that their worldviews cannot support, and importing it into their own views. Well,
exactly. One of the terms here is cultural appropriation, or really misappropriation. So we take things from, let's say, the Black culture, what have you, and we misuse it. We try to speak in their place, and again, can't do that. But I would argue there are a number of ideas. I think Francis Schaeffer hit the nail on the head many times. They do the very thing they say can't be done. It's not just their views unbiblical, which it is. Their view is actually self-refuting one more time. It's self-stultifying. It refutes itself. And so part of my job, I don't have to be mean and trot out all my arguments. I just let people talk often and say, but wait a minute, I'm trying to understand this. You just told me that's only true for a given people, but does that include your views? I had a student one time, give an example, teaching human rights. And a student, a bright guy, I don't think he's as bright as he thought he was, but he was a bright guy. We were talking about convincing people about human rights and which view would be correct and how so and whatnot. And he speaks up and he says, I just think you can't really reason with people. People believe what they want to believe, and that's the end of it. You can't really convince people. And I said, by the way, I appreciate your point, but does that apply to you too?
Right.
He didn't like that, but
what
he
you're
got
doing right
it.
now. Yeah.
It's like another student one time, he was an undergraduate in philosophy. This is a law student. He didn't realize I had a graduate degree in philosophy. But anyway, so we're talking about relativism and values and the law and whatnot. And he's really trying staunchly to defend relativism, epistemological, and it's okay, epistemological and moral. And so he's talking. I won't give his name, but he's a nice enough guy. But he's just telling me, in front of the whole class, this is true, Hawkins. And I said, okay, by the way, just help me out here. We've gone over the syllabus, and those who don't know, the syllabus is the overview of the course. It's a contract, especially in a law school. I have to abide by it once I give it. This is how we assign grades. These are the criteria, the rubrics, how I figure your grade. And in our school, it's on a curve. A bigger class, somebody gets an F. They get the lowest grade, and somebody gets the highest grade. I said, by the way, but never mind my syllabus. We've gone over that, but that's objective stuff. We're not going to talk about that. I've decided, merely because of professorial discretion, I'm going to give you the worst grade in the class. Is that okay, by the way? And I said, then I looked at the other students. If I give him the worst grade, is that okay? And they're all like, yeah, because that means they don't get it. And I said, and on what basis am I doing this? On the basis of my contract? No, because I've started.
Oh, no.
Because I can do that because it's relative. I've just simply decided, because I be the case that actually, objectively, which you don't believe in, you actually did the best on the midterm exams, the midterm exam, the final, and other assignments. You really amateur class, which means you deserve the highest grade. I want to give you the worst grade because it's relative. I can do that. I said, is that okay? Now, what do you think he said to me? Well, yeah, I'm consistent. I believe in relativism.
Right, yeah.
This would follow. I don't like it. I prefer you don't. No, you'd protest. You'd go to the dean, the president of the university, complain, try to bring me up in charges before the academic senate. I said, you would not agree with this. Maybe everybody else would, but you wouldn't, because you know it's wrong.
I've seen that. I've even used that in my own sphere of interaction, and it destroys them. It's great. I remember a guy yelling at me, there is no absolute truth. There is no absolute truth. And I just said, is that true? And he said, absolutely. Like, I can't even make that up. Like, it was incredible. A UCLA physics student, no less, saying that to me. And so,
yes, reminds me of another student one time who I was teaching on logic and reason and whatnot, and said, I don't believe this. I don't believe in logic and reason. He says, in fact, I'm going to give you 10 reasons why it's not true. Really, 10.
That's beautiful. So my last question, going back to biblical justice and social justice, what are the differences between those?
Well, biblical justice is I would argue, is fairness, is a form of fairness, and it is to be doing the right thing. Let's say in a lawsuit, you give a hold, we call it a holding or a decision. In law, it's called a holding. The judge gives a holding, or judges, based upon what's fair, what's right, given the facts, or should be. So you don't, by the way, the Bible's very clear, you don't decide in favor of somebody just because they're poor or a minority. Nor should you decide because someone's rich and powerful and famous. It's their status in the culture should have nothing to do with the holding. It should be based upon, the decision is based upon what is right, what is fair, what is just, what is good, given the actual fact pattern, what are the circumstances. So, because see, many people want to say we give preferential treatment to the poor. No, we want to honor them and help them, but I don't give them preference any more than I want to give the rich and powerful person preference. I treat them fairly. The golden rule, Leviticus 19. I want to do as I would want others to do unto me. That is in part justice. It is what would you want in the same circumstances? If you were in the position of that person, how would you want to be treated? What decision would you want to be made?
So we've talked about history, philosophy, theology. We've talked about what is critical race theory, what is intersectionality. We've talked even about ways that it's not biblical and ways that it is philosophically unsound, invalid. All of these things. And so, to try to wrap things up a bit, speak again to the parent who is looking at their son, their daughter, their multiple children who they raised, they loved, and are now looking at them as their children are looking at them as enemies because they're white, they are Protestant, they're Christians, and so speak to that parent, give them some help.
Sure, hopefully on a very practical level. We want to support and empathize and appreciate our young people, our children, for realizing that racism does exist and it is a problem. We want to treat all people fairly. But once again, we don't prefer rich and powerful over poor and oppressed. But that means we don't always judge in favor of people of color versus a white just because they're people of color. So you want to commend them for seeing that. But again, you have to add in the other part for seeing that there are injustices and that they're concerned about that. That is commendable. But we also want to be able to deal with the arguments. And I think sometimes the best way to deal with this. Now, and let me qualify this. When I say arguments, I don't mean being argumentative. People confuse that. I'm not talking about being argumentative, being a jerk, cramming your views down someone else's throat. But giving an argument, like an apologia, is a well-reasoned, rational defense for your position. Well, why do you hold this? So I really believe in just as much as possible letting people talk, including our own children. So what do you think about that? Why do you believe that? You don't believe that, do you? You're not one of those, are you? No. Why do you, as non-confrontational as possible, watching your body language, Of course, prayer, we'll come back to that because that's vital. Well, why do you hold that? What's the reason or reasons? What are your thought patterns? How did you come to this conclusion? In other words, by creating an atmosphere for dialogue. Look, I know some of your kids are still going to go off the deep end. Look, because after all, your mom or dad, but Professor Dr. So-and-so has taught me. So you've got that going against you because after all, the almighty professor knows everything, allegedly. And you're just mom and dad. I mean, come on. You're fortunate they're even talking to you. But as much as possible, as Paul would say, much as lies within you, facilitate the dialogue. Don't have to always bring it up, but when you're able, when it's appropriate. Again, why do you think this way? What goes into your thinking? Let them talk and don't just attack. Don't just even refute them, even with some really good refutations. Let them see that you value them, that you care about them as thinking individuals, as adults, right? Because part of the dynamic here is they're trying to show their own independence, that they're a person, that they've cut the apron strings or what have you of mommy and daddy. So you've got to realize that as well. So let them have their ground, but just ask thoughtful questions. Another way to do this is to say, by the way, I've got some literature on this. I'm willing to read anything you have. Would you mind, what would you want me to read? But also, would you be willing to read a book or an article? Now, I mentioned this. Now, technically, this deals with the law and with other facets. And most of you won't even read this book, although it's much smaller than my other much massive books that I have over sitting here. But this book was reviewed very well in the New York Times. And the New York Times book review section, you can find a 10-page version of this that goes through it. It's extremely helpful. That will help you and or you give to your son or daughter to give to them, to ask, would you read that? If you won't read a whole book, would you read this? And again, you have to be open to do the same. I mentioned prayer not as an afterthought. Really, it's the first line. They've been taken, I believe, they've been taken captive to a hostile viewpoint that is alien to Christianity. It's a spiritual battle. It's not just intellectual. Clearly, I'm not anti-intellectual. I taught at the university for 32 years, okay? I hope that kind of proves that's not the case, and my various degrees. But it's not just intellectual. It is spiritual. It's emotional. It's multifaceted. And so you should be praying, God, I'm praying for my son, my daughter, sons, daughters. First of all, if they're not into it, protect them, give me wisdom and insight in guarding them against this. If they bought into this, Father, I pray for their souls. I'm praying for their minds. I'm praying for them to bring every thought captive to Christ. To not be, as Paul warns Timothy, people who are confused, led astray by what is falsely called knowledge. It's fake knowledge. Pseudo in Greek, I call it pseudo. It's not even pseudo. It's falsely called knowledge. See, they think they've arrived. They are enlightened and educated, and you're not. But pray for their souls. Pray and be willing to, the dialogue may go 5, 10, 15, 20 years. You have to be willing to invest in the long run, but praying for them. And then, yes, absolutely, read what you can. Listen to podcasts like this. Listen to them over and over again until this becomes second nature to you. It may be that you cannot control yourself emotionally. You love your children so much, you're so distraught, you just can't be reasonable. Or you're just saying, I just don't get this stuff. My mind just will not wrap around this. I'm having trouble. All I've gotten is a Charlie horse between the ears and you talking about this stuff. It's not really helped me. Then talk to your spouse, talk to a friend, someone who your child or children respect, and ask them to become up to speed with this and have them talk to them. But you can love them, you can support them, and we make the distinction between love versus approval. Love versus approval. We love you, I do not approve of these ideas. I'm trying to understand them. I'm trying to see where you're coming from. And you know what? Your child knows if you're being genuine or if you're just trying to get over on them. They know the difference. These are some of the things you can do. There is some good literature. New discourses. Now, again, they're not Christians. James Lindsay is not a Christian. Peter Boghossian is not a Christian. And they don't hide that. Yeah. But I think their material is still invaluable. If I have two deadly snakes in my backyard, don't ask me how. I got a king cobra and a Mojave rattler. I don't know how they got there, but they're there. I could try to deal with both of them, assuming I have to deal with it immediately. You can't call animal control. Or I can let one snake take out the other snake, and then I'll deal with the one that's left. So yeah, James Lindsay and Peter Boghossian are not theists, they're not Christians, but I think they do an incredible job, have great free literature. Besides their books, they have a lot of free literature on their website. I would be perusing that website, listening to their podcast as well, and trying to better understand this. John, you said something earlier, even dealing with postmodernism and the history of the church. It's one intellectual fad after another. One heresy after another comes not just out there, but to invade the church. And I don't see this stuff going away, and or if it does, it'll only be replaced by some other more potent viewpoint. And so I believe time spent here is time well spent here, speaking to pastors, youth leaders, otherwise. The church needs to be up to speed on this stuff and to see why it's so problematic. Not just to say it is, but somebody in your fellowship needs to know how to deal with this stuff, and minimally to point people to resources. Because as we've already said, there are many I don't doubt well-meaning godly people who've bought into a lot of this stuff. I think they're wrong. I think they're dead wrong. I don't doubt they know God and maybe love God. But I also as well don't doubt that they are wrong. Their sincerity does not prove their view to be correct. And we need to love them as well and disagree and rise up and say, we're not going to let you teach us in the church. You're not going to teach us in our seminaries. If you insist on this, you can go teach it somewhere else. You're free to leave.
Right.
But we're not going to let this be taught to our people, to our congregations, to our leaders of our congregation.
Yeah, one guest that we're going to have on in a couple of weeks, he advocates for church discipline over this. If it comes into your church, it comes a leader in your church, a pastor in your church, like this is something where the elders need to step in and say, and follow the steps of Matthew 18.
Yes. I think it's that important. John, if I could, we have time, one more story. I do a radio program, as you know, and we deal with all kinds of issues, cults, the occult, world religions, philosophy of religion, so on and so forth, world religions. And then I teach as well at my church, but also at university. I had one black student, smart gal, and she was probably the most virulent on this, was really adamant that I was guilty of white privilege and what she's saying was true, and whites are all racist and what have you, and this stuff's all true. And she bought into social constructivism. And at one point I said to her, and because she was giving me what for time and time again on this, she actually alienated my whole class. Actually, even my other students of color disagreed with her. They said, no, we know Hawkins, he's not a racist. Whatever else he is, but he's not a racist. And so I said to her, at one point I said to her, oh, by the way, I've decided that I'm actually a black female. And because I feel like it, because I believe I am. And there was one gal, head of one chapter of the NAACP, who did this, who was not black, biologically, if you will. Yeah. I said, I've decided I'm black, I'm female, and I'm going to be applying for your scholarships. Is that okay? And she's like, you can't do that. That's not right. I said, what do you mean it's not right? You've already told me you believe this. You already told me you believe social constructivism. In my world, there's people like me. I have another friend who's about my size and my color. He believes he's a 6'5" bisexual Asian woman, and he's going to be applying for Asian women's scholarships and sports scholarships. What's the problem with you? Are you a bigot? Are you a narrow-minded obscurantist? What's your problem? You've already told me this stuff is okay and tolerant and enlightened. So why do you have a problem with what I'm saying? She got it. And she actually changed some of her views. I'm not saying she changed all of them, but she actually changed her tone because she realized, whoops, I've already bought into this, and all he's doing is applying these views. And so technically, if he thinks he's a person of color and a woman, he could apply for these scholarships, even though I want to say, he doesn't have my experience. He's not been discriminated like I have. He's not entitled to it. But if I really buy into the stuff, this is what follows. And she pulled back on that.
So my last question is this. If a person cannot fix their whiteness personally, and if the system, you can't use the master's tools to fix the master's house, you can't fix the system, And what is the end game here?
The end game, there's several aspects. We need to acquiesce and basically hand over money and other resources that we have allegedly gained illegitimately. Generational wealth, they would say, is another key term, and give it to them. And so we need to go above and beyond. I'll use the term call of duty. They wouldn't say that. They'd say it's what's required. It's not the other call of duty to promote them into positions at work or school or what have you, to give them literally some of our property and our wealth. The end game is, some of them have said, only we whites can fix this. But we can't ultimately get rid of our whiteness. We can never be cured of this. We can only do the ongoing work. But in the meantime, we can shut up and let them speak for themselves. They may not want, some would say shut up, some would say just be quiet, more genteel. Yeah. But deal with gentrification and all that issues as well. We've appropriated their property, we're told, and so on and so forth. So we need to hand this over. Many believe in reparations. But the other issue is, we can give literally over our so-called personal property, real and personal property, to them and do everything in our power to promote them. Because the name of the game here is not equality, but equity. See, equality is everybody gets treated equally. But of course, even given people an equal education, there's still different results. Equity, which is a key term here, is no, everybody needs to end up in the same place. And so if I need to give someone more chances, more opportunity, or I simply need to I work for a living, they can't get a job, keep a job, I need to give away some of my funds. So the end game is equity. We're all allegedly equal, no matter where we started, and no matter what chances we were given. Equity is the name of the game. That's the end game.
And the people that are going to disagree with that, it's going to be through the force of government.
Right. And so people like you and me are not compliant, so we need the government to enforce this. Exactly. This needs to be enforced. Go back, I think we've come full circle. Remember the Communist Revolution in Russia, in the former Soviet Union. Lenin and then Stalin and others, if violence is necessary, some are a little hesitant here, but many, especially in Black Lives Matter, Thousand Currents and other contemporary organizations, believe violence is a necessary tool, especially if it's just destroying property. That's not
right.
Life. So yeah, we use violence, we use the government, and if the government won't comply, we will take matters into our own hands.
So it seems like really the end game for a racist group of people who've developed a racist system is a complete overturning revolution of that system.
Yeah, that was what was necessary. And in the former Soviet Union, Lenin saw that we must use violence to deal with this. And it's the means justifies the ends. The ends is alleged equality, which never happened, of course, across the board. Not just equity, but equality. Never happened. Even Stalin one time was asked, somebody said to him, when will the violence end? When will the violence end? That is against non-communists or party members who are not in good standing or as good as standing as they should be or what have you. And he looked at them in disbelief and said, when will it end? Basically, to paraphrase, it will never end, because as long as it's necessary, and it will always be necessary, there will always be violence. The end game, the worst form, the most robust form on voids will be full-on violence.
Well, Craig, we're going to end there because I think time has completely gotten away from me because I love all of this stuff and I love talking to you. But I really appreciate your time. I really cannot thank you enough for the massive amount of time you've given us and for all of the work that the Lord has used you to do, not only in the church in general, but in my own life. I have benefited from your ministry for over 20 years, and I can't thank you enough for your time, for your ministry, for even your family giving you the time to be able to do this. And so thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, John. You're very kind, and appreciate all that you're doing, and Dale and the other members of your staff and of the fellowship there. By God's grace, keep up the good work.
Thank you, my friend. We'll see you at the end of the month where you're going to come and be a part of the series that we're going to do. So I can't wait for that as well.
Looking forward to that myself.
All right, my friend. Take care.
Thank you.